Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the World Affairs Forum Speaker Series. On behalf of the Board of Directors, I want to welcome each of you to our virtual community today. My name is Wendy Scratt, and I am the Executive Director of World Affairs Forum. Today, we're going to be discussing U.S. foreign policy after January 20th, 2021. I want to thank each of you for joining us today, for taking the time to be a part of this conversation. Your voice, your contribution to these conversations does make a real difference. Just maybe you've heard some talk about divisions in our country, and I can tell you that time and time again, our speakers consistently note that organizations like ours, nonpartisan local community groups, centering conversations around expert input are a big part of this solution in bridging these divides. We can't do that without you and your contributions to these conversations, so I want to thank you personally. In recognition of the importance of connecting our audience with each other as well as with our speakers, in January we're going to be moving to the meeting Zoom format instead of the webinar format for our speaker events. This is going to take a little bit of retraining for our staff as well as you as our audience, but in the end it's going to help us to create a better connected community as well as the access to our wonderful guests. We're also going to be launching some new small social media discussion groups in the new calendar year. You'll be hearing more about that on our email distribution list. But today, we are so excited to finally host this post-presidential election conversation with Michael O'Hanlon and our moderator today, George Paik. A brief intro and I'll send it off to them. Michael O'Hanlon is a senior fellow and director of research in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution, where he specializes in US defense strategy, the use of military force, and American national security policy. He co-directs the Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology, the Defense Industrial Base Working Group, and the Africa Security Initiative within the Foreign Policy Program as well. Our moderator today, George Paik, aside from being a past chair and longtime supporter of World Affairs Forum, is a former political affairs officer in the US Foreign Service and a 20-year veteran of US capital markets. He is a managing director at Lord Capital, a global finance firm in New York. Our program today will run until 1 o'clock, and we will be taking audience questions during the second half of the conversation when I'll come back in. Please submit your questions at any time into the Q&A area. Only the Q&A area is where we can easily track those, so please submit them at any time in the conversation. And now I'm going to hand it off to George and Mike. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Wendy, and welcome, Mike, and thanks for being with us today. I want to start just by saying some of our members, not all, are going to be aware that there is an active strategic discourse in our foreign policy community, and it has a life of its own, somewhat outside of direct politics, so it lives somewhat outside of direct media coverage. And our speaker, Mike, you're a major figure in that discourse. And I would say that you are, I've particularly noted that you give a lot of thought to matters where the rubber meets the road. Your past books being Beyond NATO and a question of how that, the extension of NATO might have affected our position. Or in the Senkaku Paradox, you discuss the dilemma we face when China moves on an uninhabited rock and puts us in a place between failing to support an ally in a territorial dispute or risking world war on the other hand. These are the kinds of things that make a big difference in the way actual strategies play out, and it's always been a pleasure to read those. So we understand that your next book advocates a strategy you call resolute restraint. So let me just get right to it. What could you give us a capsule of what that is and where it takes this strategic discourse?
Well, thank you, George and Wendy, and hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. By the way, I am admiring George's backdrop. I'm only hoping that you're not actually inundated with snow already a few hundred miles to the north of where I'm sitting, but it looks very nice if you are. And I wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving, even in this tumultuous year. And the basic idea of my book, you know, there's an oxymoronic quality to the title, which is of course deliberate, The Art of War in an Age of Peace. What I'm trying to say is that actually we shouldn't get too overwrought about the negative headlines, which are plentiful. And obviously 2020 brought plenty with the multiple whammies of COVID, riots in the streets, and the very bitter political campaign. But if one takes a step back, the world actually, you know, it sounds a little ironic to say it, and I don't want to sound callous, but the world in many ways has never been better off. And I think that will again become more apparent by a year from now, when the vaccinations against COVID are widespread, and also, of course, when the political transition here in the United States will be over. At least for the moment, we may have a semi-normal political dialogue at that point. But in terms of the overall architecture of the global order, the relations between the great powers, even though there are tensions in Ukraine, tensions in Syria, tensions in the East and South China Seas, these are not the cornerstones or the most important focal points of geopolitics. They are not where most people live in the world today. They are not the most important strategic locations in the world today. They are not threatening the core territorial or political viability of major American allies or the United States. And therefore, I would argue that great power relations have an element of stability, even if there is also a fair amount of fray at the edges and in some of the hinterlands. Now, I don't want to downplay the importance of that fray in the hinterlands, you know, the Senkaku Islands, the South China Sea, the Scarborough Shoal, some of the more remote areas of Eastern Europe, because crises there can lead to conflagration and escalation. And we saw something like that in World War I, which I'm sort of haunted by and often go back to in my thinking, the outbreak of World War I, which is just so unthinkable, given how much brilliance was in the world at that time, so many breakthroughs in physics and chemistry, so much globalization in an earlier vintage with the railroads and ocean liners, the beginnings of vehicles on the ground and in the air. And yet these leaders in Europe brought themselves into a horrible war. So I don't want to exclude that possibility. And that's why I still think we need to worry about the art of war, which means being ready for war, but also, of course, knowing how to avoid war and use diplomacy and George's successors at the State Department to try to avoid anything but the most necessary of all wars. So it's the art of war in an age of peace, because I think that we need to stay vigilant and prepared, but we also should not overstate the problems of the world or assume that each and every probing, exploratory assertiveness by Russia or China requires, you know, a firm military American response. I think we have a little more cushion, a little more room for give, and frankly, a little bit better position in the overall international system than would be the case if somehow we were so perilously placed that we had to respond to each and every tiny provocation as if it was the beginning of, you know, Hitler moving in on the Sudetenland or Austria or something like that. You know, in other words, a small thing that's foreshadowing a much bigger thing. I don't believe that's today's world. So I think we can actually take the temperature down a degree or two from where a lot of the headlines tend to want to take us, as long as we stay vigilant and prepared. The deterrence that we've helped create is fragile, but it's also in many ways pretty impressive, and I think offers a lot of reason for hope about the future stability of the world, especially in the areas we care about most, Central and Western Europe, East Asia, the Americas. And I think those are still the centerpieces of where American strategic and military concerns are the most important. And I think those theaters actually look more good than bad from an American national security point of view.
Great, thank you. Well, with that as context, why don't I start with the question of policy today. Your op-ed in Friday's Wall Street Journal was titled "Joe Biden Can Build on Trump's Foreign Policy." Do you think he could? How does a possible strategic narrative of a Biden administration fit, not fit, with resolute restraint, and where might it go?
Thank you, George. Well, let me talk about that op-ed for a minute. First of all, I haven't gotten a whole huge amount of fan mail from my fellow Democrats on that op-ed, although it was not meant to support or applaud anything about Donald Trump.
Right.
And in fact, I didn't even really want to applaud too much about his broader administration, although I do think Jim Mattis and Mark Esper did a pretty good job at the Pentagon. And the Congress also supported the Pentagon with a fair amount of extra money and authorities. Some people will find that excessive. And obviously in a time of COVID and huge deficits, we have to worry about trying to tighten our belts in some places and really in all places in the federal budget. But nonetheless, the Department of Defense and our military preparedness, I think, is in pretty good shape, mostly because of who Trump hired, even if he ultimately, of course, fired these people. So don't get me wrong, let me just put forth, I'm very happy that Donald Trump was defeated. Leave aside politics and ideology, I just don't like the temperament and that kind of an approach towards the job of most powerful in the world with your finger on the nuclear button. And the fact that he fired Mattis and Esper, who are largely responsible for, I think, his best parts of his legacy, is just testament to the fact that I'm not supporting Trump. However, I do think the Department of Defense is in pretty good shape. I'm nervous about the number of people who have been booted out and the temporary weakness in the civilian leadership that will endure until Joe Biden comes into office in 2 months. But I think in many other ways, the Department of Defense is in good shape. I also argued that USMCA, the revised NAFTA, is an idea that borrows from the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Barack Obama had pushed. Ultimately, both Trump and Hillary Clinton opposed TPP back in 2016 as Americans started to get a little bit nervous about these modern trade deals, which seem to trample over workers' rights and not protect intellectual property enough. But interestingly, TPP was supposed to do a better job of that than previous agreements. Trump borrowed from TPP when he renegotiated NAFTA and created USMCA. And I'm suggesting now there's an opportunity to sort of take that USMCA and do a jujitsu back to the Asia Pacific and maybe tweak TPP in its original form a bit and now finally push it. Because after all, TPP does protect workers' rights, environmental rights, and intellectual property rights better than previous trade deals. And it may not be able, therefore, to include China in the first instance, which is okay with me. So that's another example of where I think there are opportunities. And then finally, I said, even on issues where I think Trump has floundered badly, for example, North Korea or Iran, he's sometimes broken down barriers that previously prevented us from exploring a fuller range of policy options or diplomatic approaches. And if an incoming Biden administration is smart, rather than just run against or govern against every single thing Trump did, it will look for opportunities, if you will, to sort of salvage something out of the ruins. Because there are cases in which, even if you don't like Trump's overall approach to foreign policy, and I do not, nonetheless, like he has again created some new possibilities with the things he's attempted, even in those cases where he's failed badly. In terms of resolute restraint, I guess what I'm trying to do is just again recognize I think we've got some room for maneuver on a number of these issues. If I was of the view that the world was acutely perilous and every single American action needed to be handled perfectly, or we would be finding ourselves in a major power crisis or war very quickly, I would be a lot more anxious. I wouldn't sleep as well at night. But I actually think the structure of the international order is pretty good. And therefore we can say, hey, let's just take stock of where we are after 4 years of Trump. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't fun to watch. It's not even over yet. But there are some places where Biden, to be sure, just has to completely change approach, reinforcing allies, no longer getting into these fights publicly with major allies, no longer pulling out of major treaties with no real sense of what comes next on Iran or climate or what have you. But there are other cases where we can just sort of look back, take stock, take a breath, and say, there's some opportunities here that we can build on, recognizing that our strategic position is pretty good to start with. And we actually have some time to get this right.
Appreciate that. Boy, as you talk about trade and the world order, one of the sub-themes of angst is about the internet, about the liberal world order, but sometimes that also goes over to economics and the financial order and refers to things like the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. Do you feel that we have that same space at this point, or do you have another analysis of those kinds of concerns?
Yeah, George, and I hope you and maybe some of the others on the call will give their views as well, because again, I'm conscious I'm speaking to a very sophisticated financial crowd in the greater New York area. And I really begin with a military specialization more than an economic one. But I do think that if we take stock of where we are in overall economic affairs, the world order again is looking pretty good. And I don't talk so much about the liberal order because that term is confusing. It means one thing in American politics, it means something else in international relations. And even in international relations, it implies a very ambitious agenda, largely promoting things I agree with, like better human rights, more democracy, better environmental protections, but not all of which are equally crucial as the basic foundational building blocks to the world in which we live. So I tend to fall back on the phrase, the rules-based order, where I think we do need to maintain certain key rules. Countries don't attack each other. Countries don't invade each other. Countries don't use nuclear weapons against each other. We try to prevent nuclear proliferation. And on the economic side, we try to promote free and fair trade, even if we sometimes disagree over exactly what that means and what the next deal should look like. And we try to promote a relatively free financial order, where if the United States is going to take advantage of the place of our banks in this global financial system and sometimes apply punishment or sanctions against an Iran or a North Korea or a Russia, we should do so with care and with multilateral support, because we don't want to give others the incentive to build up alternative financial mechanisms and networks because they're tired of Washington setting all these rules on its own. That would be a real travesty. It would be a travesty for our financial system and its health, but it would also hurt our foreign policy, because we should want to really use those tools for the cases that matter most, and sort of keep our powder dry so countries don't have an incentive to develop workarounds. I want countries to be dependent on the American financial system, so that if Vladimir Putin ever does something really crazy, like invade the Baltic states, in addition to any military response we might make, at that point, we can really come down like a ton of bricks economically. And because he knows that in advance, he'll be less likely to carry out such an attack in the first place. So again, I think economics and our place in this economic order, where we have essentially 2/3 of the world's economic power within a broadly defined Western alliance system, 2/3 of the world's GDP, 2/3 of the world's military spending. If you count NATO, the East Asian allies, and maybe some of the Middle Eastern security partnerships. We have an amazing concentration of power within countries and communities that are friendly to us. So if we view that alliance system in these terms as our main strategic asset, then I think we are really in a great place, because the economics and the military power come together. Interestingly, even though Donald Trump didn't really seem to believe that, everybody else in his administration did, because when you go back and you read the documents that they wrote, the basic doctrine and a lot of how they carried out their jobs, Mattis and Esper and others, they really reinforced the importance of alliances and of strengthening and upholding alliance commitments. And I think that also applies not just to the military side, but to the economic side of the relationships.
Well, for somebody disclaiming economic expertise, you've certainly given us a lesson right there, if I may say so. Let me dig a little bit more into some of the rubber meets the road questions. I'm moved just because I saw a book review by John Bolton, and he used the word asymmetry, asymmetric, which made me think of your Senkaku's question. However, he says an asymmetric response would be for the US to grant Taiwan full diplomatic recognition. Could you parse that against your concepts of asymmetric responses and uses of appropriate uses of force, much as you've talked about keeping our powder dry in economics? Is that the kind of thing you had in mind when you talk about that kind of thing?
No, and I like John Bolton. We used to have the same dry cleaner for 10 years in Bethesda, Maryland. I run into him all the time, and we testified together before Congress a couple times, maybe 20 years ago. And he's a very bright guy. And I think he tried to steer Donald Trump in generally healthy directions. But he also has a neoconservative dimension to his thinking, which is one of the aspects of foreign policy thinking that I most oppose. Because the Taiwan example to me is a perfect case of where you should not do something quite that assertive. My question is why? Why would we want to? Because what John Bolton's proposing is that we have a showdown with the world's largest, most populous economy or country and number 2 economy, number 2 military spender, over a piece of territory that China feels is just as much part of China as we would say that Hawaii or maybe even Florida or some other, distant, but still not distant, but, sort of a more appendage part of the country in terms of the geography of the core, or some state that was admitted late to the Union. We would still consider those parts of the country every bit as central to our national territory as anything else. And that's how China looks at Taiwan. And why would we want to therefore challenge China to a showdown over Taiwan? What Bolton's proposing is basically that we say Taiwan's a separate country. What's done is done. It's not just de facto, it's de jure. Taiwan and China are separate, and we're going to solidify that in concrete. And by implication, because just diplomatic recognition is really not that big of a statement, but the implication is we're going to help Taiwan defend itself militarily once China decides to attack them after that recognition has been granted and Taiwan presumably has declared its own independence, because you only recognize a country that sees itself as a country. A lot of American foreign policy has been to talk Taiwan out of making such statements, and we've sort of managed. Now, you could say this can't last forever, and so why don't we just get it over with? But I don't see any point in risking World War III to get over with clarification of a situation that day to day is pretty good. The people on Taiwan live autonomously. They have a great economy. They have some degree of likely military protection from the United States, even if it's not formalized in a treaty anymore. And China doesn't seem to be in any huge hurry to achieve this reunification, which perhaps means that there's time to debate what kind of a model, what kind of a system, what kind of a confederation or a commonwealth could perhaps be conceptualized someday that both Taiwan and Beijing could profess loyalty to, but it would not require Taiwan to be submissive to the PRC. I'm still hoping that kind of a model can emerge, and I think we should play for time in the hope that, it may become possible, and certainly going down that path is preferable to risking a 10 or 20% or 30 or 40% chance of the outbreak of World War III, just so we can give Taiwan that last measure of formal diplomatic protection. Doesn't make any sense to me.
Timing's an interesting topic that I think that you mentioned that probably doesn't get its fair due. Maybe patience would be appropriate too. Where does the Middle East fit in your view with this? Because it does seem to persist over time and always seems to come out and find its way in when you think you've got it contained. And things are really moving there right now, between particularly the agreements with Israel and the Gulf states, rise of Turkey, and what we've done with Iran, which you did mention in your op-ed.
Well, it's fascinating because, who would have thought that half the Middle East could be, or maybe a third of the Middle East could sort of be up in flames. And yet the price of oil is still $40 a barrel. And if you had told me those two things 10 years ago, before the Arab Spring, as it was called, that we would have ongoing protracted civil war from Yemen to Libya to Syria, Lebanon destabilized, Iraq still, vulnerable from time to time, Iran pursuing some kind of, regional ambitions and maybe even nuclear ambitions. And despite all that, the main American friends in the region are safe and the price of oil is low. I realize there are a lot of reasons why the price of oil is low, but it's still stunning to me that the Middle East could be in such turmoil and that we could have this happy confluence of factors producing, affordable energy. I'm not sure that's guaranteed to last forever. And I certainly don't think we can afford to just put the Middle East on autopilot. But I sort of feel like we have found a model that after all these struggles is not so bad. And the model is basically put a few thousand US troops in a multitude of countries in the broader region, a few thousand troops each in each country where we have a strong partnership. And those forces will partly create regional power projection capacity for the United States, but they will also create partnerships and intelligence gathering platforms, and if need be, staging grounds for commando or special forces operations against extremists who may come to our attention. Hopefully we would conduct those kinds of operations with indigenous allies and partners as much as possible. And so we have a few thousand forces in Afghanistan, a few thousand in Iraq, a few thousand in Bahrain, a few thousand in Kuwait, a few thousand in Qatar, a few thousand in Saudi Arabia. We've got some in Egypt. We've got, some in Jordan, not as many, some in Syria, not as many, but it's really quite a diversified presence. And it also includes Turkey to the north and Djibouti to the south, spanning this whole region. And therefore, we're not particularly dependent on any one of those countries. And if need be, we could pull out of any one of them and still maintain a pretty strong regional portfolio of capability. I think that's, generally speaking, a good strategy for the United States, even if it's frustrating, even if it means we can't immediately extricate ourselves from the region or end any of the particular wars that might be ongoing. We can't stop the humanitarian suffering in all of these places like Syria and Yemen. And I'm very saddened to see that we can't. But I also feel that in terms of core American national security interests, we're not in bad shape. I would actually like to scale back a little bit in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, probably Kuwait. But I think the overall regional posture actually is, in broad terms, about the right concept for where we are in today's world.
Again, we have space, if I hear you correctly. We're getting towards the point where I want to open it up, but before we do that, it kind of seems like an oddball, but COVID, is this a game changer? Is this a passing circumstance? Is it an oddball? Is there something that's going to build into our strategic thinking in any way?
That's a great question, and always tough to assess this sort of thing while it's happening.
Yes.
But
the spot.
Right. But, I tend, and it's obviously been a great tragedy. And one has to begin by saying that it's been, so sad for so many families, for so many people. It's been so deadly. And obviously, it's also made life very hard for a lot of people as schools have been shut and, people have lost jobs. So I need to begin with that. And it's also set back anti-poverty efforts around the world. In 2019, for the first time in human history, as documented by my colleague at Brookings, Homi Karas, and that's spelled K-H-A-R-A-S for anybody who wants to look up his work. He documented that half the world's population was now middle class or better for the first time in human history. And so, we get nostalgic about the world of the 1950s when America was so powerful, blah, blah, blah. I'm not that nostalgic for the 1950s because I remember, well, I wasn't alive yet, but I remember from history books just how dangerous the Cold War was becoming, but also the number of people in the world in 1950 who were middle class or above was about 10% of the world's population. And now it's 50%. Well, unfortunately, we've slipped because of COVID. And there are a lot of parts of the world where the poor have become poorer, and people who are starting to get a glimpse of what middle class life could be have now fallen backward. And it's going to take a few years to get back to that. So I think that's the most important overall implication of COVID, which has to do with the quality of life, the health, and the economic well-being of so many people around the world. But in strategic terms, I actually think the effects are less, from what I can tell. I don't see it ending any conflicts. I don't see, Vladimir Putin calling up Joe Biden and saying, can't we go do a sing-along and raise money for COVID-19 victims and put all these US-Russia geostrategic problems behind us. So I don't see any amelioration of previous challenges or crises, but I also don't see any intensification. And I think that even though we've added a couple $1 trillion to our national debt, the United States will still be able to maintain a strong military. I don't think Joe Biden's going to slash the defense budget. So I think we'll be able to maintain, along with our allies, a generally stable international order. I don't think Kim Jong-un's going to start thinking, oh, because of COVID, now I can attack South Korea or something like that. So when I actually map the COVID situation onto previous and more classic geostrategic challenges or crises, I see not as much effect as I might have first guessed, given that the magnitude of COVID is so great. But I'm not sure I see the dynamics by which it is creating whole new dimensions to these traditional problems, either for better or for worse.
Perspective for us to keep. We have a lot of questions, so Wendy, why don't you?
We do, so there's a lot of questions in particular about the Middle East, and I'll share with you one particular comment that came into my phone, basically saying, can we push back on what seems like a message from the speaker that everything is quote unquote fine in the Middle East? So I'll give you a chance to sort of address that overarchingly, but also another question, who are the main American friends out there? And there are definitely several questions about Palestine and what the incoming administration is thinking about the Palestinian struggle in particular.
Okay, thank you, Wendy. Well, first of all, of course, I did not say the Middle East is fine. I think I inventoried the number of places that are up in flames and the ongoing ambitions of Iran. And my main point was, who could have thought the Middle East could be so troubled? And yet, in terms of core American strategic interests, our closest friends are still relatively safe, like Israel and Jordan, Oman, Tunisia, Egypt, although I don't like the way we support Sisi, and I think we've gone too far in essentially just reestablishing the kind of relationship we used to have with President Mubarak in Egypt before the Arab Spring. I'm not applauding American policy, and I'm certainly not singing the, any joyous song of how the Middle East is now the place to be and where you want to take your family on vacation. It's a mess. But nonetheless, oil is $40 a barrel. There hasn't been a new development in nuclear weapons proliferation in the broader region. Whether you like the Obama-Iran nuclear deal or not, it at least bought us a little more time. And so what's striking to me is that the Middle East is not necessarily disrupting the entire rest of the world. Its problems are partly and partially confined within the broader Middle East. And we're also, at least since the rise of the ISIS caliphate in 2014 or so, we haven't seen the core Western world affected that much by terrorism coming out of the broader Middle East either. Now, this is not in any way a Pollyannish assessment of the region, nor do I suggest the situation is necessarily stable. But it's still striking that things aren't worse for our overall interests. However, again, I say we have to stay because we have to make sure they don't get worse, and hopefully in some places help make them better, which is why I just endorsed keeping US military forces in at least half a dozen different countries in the broader Central Command theater. That's not because I think everything's sunny and peachy, to be clear. And finally, on the Palestinian issue, I don't really know how to foresee this one. I still think the only realistic path forward is a two-state solution. I hope the United States is actually willing to be a little tougher on Israel if need be in order to push in that direction. I'm not sure it's realistic with Netanyahu in power. I'm not a fan of Prime Minister Netanyahu. I think he's actually duplicitous, not just ideological in a way that I disagree with, but actually tells us one thing, knows how to play American politics probably better than any other foreign leader. And so I don't trust him. And I think that he has no interest in a two-state solution. So we may have to try to create some pressure on our Israeli friends to move in that direction. I'm not some big left-winger on this issue. I fully support a strong US relationship with Israel. But the bargain always was that we had to find justice and stability for the Palestinians, and that piece of it is in dire jeopardy, and I think we have to get back to it.
And a follow-up in that same area, do you think that the assumed Biden administration should join the JCPOA and come up with a new policy on North Korea and Iran?
I think the JCPOA is a little bit nearing its expiration date, because it is quite literally nearing its expiration date in the sense that some of the restrictions on Iranian nuclear activity that were built into that 2015 agreement were due to start expiring. They are due to start expiring in 2023. which will be just 2 years after Joe Biden takes the oath of office. So that deal was always meant to be an interim agreement. And there were certain parts of the deal that would endure permanently, but a lot of the quantitative restrictions on Iranian nuclear enrichment, for example, were 8 to 10 years. And I think, going back to my op-ed from last week, one of the things Donald Trump has done, and there could be a useful dimension to this, he has shown that even if we're much tougher on Iran than Barack Obama had been, that Iran doesn't have that many good responses. And therefore, we can probably work towards and work for a little better deal than the JCPOA. Maybe we have to have some kind of an interim agreement to get back into it quickly so that we can, and allow some modest economic relief for Iran in the interim, so we don't, jeopardize the prospects for some kind of a future accord, because Iran and others certainly expect that Joe Biden will go right back to the JCPOA. But I think the better policy would be to try to extend the limitations in that agreement into the indefinite future, so they do not expire in 2023 or 2025. Still focus that deal on Iran's nuclear behavior, not on the entire set of issues with which we have disagreements with Tehran, but make it a better nuclear deal that has a longer time horizon. And I think we probably have enough clout with the sanctions and the economic punishment that we're meting out to Iran. It would have to take that kind of a proposal pretty seriously. So that's what I favor in regard to Iran.
Your conversation is bringing up all variety of types of questions, so I'm going to try to cover some of the range of them. Relatively simple, is the Asia pivot back on the agenda with Biden? And then related in some ways, is Modi a trustworthy ally?
Well, the U.S.-India relationship has continued to improve for 20 years under 4 American presidents. Well, I guess 3 since then, but about to be 4, and under several Indian prime ministers. So I don't think Modi is completely trustworthy, but I think the trajectory of the relationship is healthy. And to be fair to Donald Trump, he continued that, just as Barack Obama had, just as George W. Bush had, and just as Bill Clinton had. So I guess it already is 4, I'm sorry. And so that part, I think, is, if we don't put too much pressure on the U.S.-India relationship and just let it develop gradually and naturally, I think it will be very good for our economy, good for our strategic posture in Asia. I don't favor an alliance with India. Most Indians don't want an alliance with the United States, but an increasingly cooperative security partnership, I think, makes sense and is in the interest of both countries if we just sort of let it develop along its natural course. In terms of the rebalance or the pivot, the pivot was in small part a military policy, in slightly larger part a diplomatic policy, and most of all supposed to be an economic policy with TPP. So the pivot and rebalance, I think, can only really get back on course if we find a way to reinvigorate our role in TPP, the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership. And that may be possible now that, again, the revised NAFTA agreement that President Trump successfully negotiated, USMCA, has incorporated many of the same aspects and elements that I think TPP was designed to champion in the first place. So if we create a little bit of political space so that previous critics of TPP can support something that is mostly the same thing they previously opposed, but add on a few modifications and a few decorations such that they can say it's something different, and thereby engender the kind of political support on both sides of the aisle we need, then I think, yes, the rebalance and pivot could be back on. And meanwhile, we've also added $100 billion to our defense budget, which was not all directed at forces in the Asia Pacific, but a rising tide lifts all boats. And the Pacific Theater, or the Indo-Pacific Theater, is one of our 3 main areas of the broader world where the U.S. military focuses its attention, along with the Persian Gulf, and Middle East, and then Europe. So if you add $100 billion to the annual defense budget, from the low 600 billion range under Obama to the mid 700 range now at the end of the Trump presidency, you've got more power to direct to the Asia Pacific as well. And so, yes, I think we have seen some elements of the rebalance continue even under Trump. And if we can figure out a way to make TPP work or a modified TPP, then the full policy logic can more or less be put into effect.
And George, feel free to jump in with follow-up questions, but I'm hearing Mike say so many things that touch on other questions, so I'm going to try to keep linking things. Derek asks, what's the most responsible way for the U.S. To ensure a defense that remains a deterrent and allows for our strategic initiatives while scaling back on our federal defense spending? It seems clear that a leftward movement is growing here at home, and reducing defense spending in favor of domestic initiatives is their priority, and only a matter of time before enough structural power is accrued to make these substantial changes.
Well, I don't think we should cut the defense budget a lot, and I don't think Joe Biden will. Let's bear in mind, Joe Biden is a 77-year-old man. I think he's turning 78 pretty soon. I forget his birthday. But anyway, he's old enough to have lived through the Vietnam era. Not only in terms of seeing the pain that that kind of a war can cause the country, but also seeing the political vulnerability that kind of a war could cause the Democratic Party. And the Democrats got on the wrong side of the national security issue, and it took them decades to get back to an even playing field or close to that with the Republicans. And Joe Biden is not going to hand the Republicans an easy political issue to say that, you know, he has jeopardized the basic health, well-being of the U.S. armed forces and military families. And the people that I know are in contention to be at the top of the Pentagon certainly don't have that attitude themselves. I've read a lot of Michelle Flournoy's stuff over the years, for example, and she is certainly rather hawkish. I think she's a very smart and careful and cautious hawk, but I think she will make a powerful case for making sure the defense budget is not cut. Having said that, even before COVID and even before the election, Donald Trump himself and his budget projections for the next 5 years anticipated a flat defense budget. So the buildup was already going to be over, even if Trump had won re-election, even if COVID had never hit. And I think the way you should view this, you know, if we've got $1 trillion a year structural deficit, even after the recovery from COVID, leaving aside, you know, the fact that it was a $3 trillion deficit in 2020. But if we have a $1 trillion a year deficit and a $750 billion a year defense budget, even if you cut that defense budget by 1/3, you've only reduced the deficit by 20%. So it's just not worth it. Now you may decide that you want to target, you know, define a broader national security budget and think that pandemic disease, biological threats, climate threats should all be addressed within the same overall budget. And therefore you take a little bit from the Pentagon, you know, rob a little bit from Peter to pay Paul and address some other threat with some of that money. But even there, I believe it's going to be difficult. Michelle Flournoy is on record back in 2018 saying we need 3 to 5% annual real growth in the defense budget indefinitely in order to properly implement the national defense strategy of Jim Mattis, which she otherwise largely supported and which echoed some of the latter Obama administration thinking in a concept they called the third offset. In other words, there's a lot of bipartisan support for strong military. And I think what you're going to see is the Pentagon is going to be asked to tighten its belt and shave off a little bit here and a little bit there and more or less live within a flat budget. And over time, that will become a smaller and smaller percent of the GDP. I think that's the right way to think about defense budget cuts. And I'd be very surprised if Biden and company come to a different conclusion.
Actually, Wendy, as I was looking at the questions, I saw one about Turkey, which also played into the discussion of the defense budget. Of course, the question about Turkey is what the heck do we do with them? They're supposedly our ally. What that adds to me is the question of sort of proliferating fraying of things. And I wonder if that also means more defense budget rather than less. And as to what that defense budget might be, a third offset I take to be mostly a technology-based thing. Does that, I don't know if that's, is that sufficient in your mind? Does that also require, would the kinds of things we're looking at also require more old-fashioned hardware on the ground in more places? Question.
I don't think we need more on the ground in more places, George, but I do think you're correct that the third offset and the national defense strategy are both largely about innovation, long-term modernization, addressing our vulnerabilities, getting on top of the new technology trends and making sure that we can take advantage of them, reestablishing some sense that America is not in decline, but it's, you know, the most powerful country on earth and the best armed forces, and nothing's going to change about that. So part of it is perceptual and part of it is real and technological. But I think either way, it does tend to focus the attention on the acquisition accounts, procurement and research development, testing and evaluation, to use the Pentagon phrases. And I think part of what you're going to have to see is the military finding ways to protect those accounts, even as we live within a flat budget. But it's not as if there are, you know, easy ways to cut from other parts of the defense budget. Nobody wants to pay our brave men and women in uniform and their families less for their service. Nobody wants to leave our forces unprepared for the operations that they conduct around the world all the time. So you wind up really looking for more efficiency and maybe a somewhat smaller military. And by somewhat smaller, I mean a few percent, single-digit percent smaller. Because I think if we manage the force a little more cleverly, we can probably find a way to get by with that. And that's where you get the savings that then allow you to protect the most important areas of innovation, even within a more austere budget environment. So that's my basic take on where defense priorities have to be: quality over quantity. But quantity has an importance all its own, and you can't just start slashing the force structure while we're trying to deter conflict in 3 major theaters and continue ongoing efforts in the war on terror. So I'm afraid that, again, the force structure cuts are going to have to be modest, not large. That's the basic way I would answer that question. You know, we do have a few tough allies: Turkey, the Philippines, Hungary, not to mention most of the Middle Eastern security partners who are not our allies, but they're our close security partners. And, you know, there are a few principles you apply to this, one of which is that you don't have to endorse everything they do. You can use sanctions, you can use punishment, you can cut Turkey off from the F-35 program, the fighter jet that they were helping us make until they bought the Russian air defense system. You can disinvite Hungary from certain summits, you know, if things trend in the wrong direction there. You can avoid visits to the Philippines by your top leadership if Duterte moves in a direction we don't like. You can elect not to come to the Philippines defense if they wind up in a squabble over some remote island with China. You know, we're not obliged under, if you read the terms of these treaties that we're in clearly, we're not obliged to some robust military response the first time an ally gets into trouble. And so especially if the ally is non-democratic or functioning in an increasingly non-democratic way and causing trouble itself, those, therefore, those situations and circumstances provide us the justification to withhold some of our support. And that's one of the ways I would recommend that we handle the more difficult alliances.
There are 2 very thoughtful questions related to climate change that I'm going to read just both of them for you. And I think it's important, you know, we have Gillian Tett coming to us next month to talk about, you know, greening the economy, I think is her subject of choice now. And so in the context of, you know, how national security and expense spending is related to, you know, all of these other topics, you've got a lot, you've got a very, I almost wish that I could really just let my audience at you. That's why we're moving to the meeting format, because they would do a great job with this. So the first is climate-induced migration a meaningful risk to the world order and stability? And if so, how should the US approach the issue from a diplomatic, economic standpoint? And the second is a couple sentences. Does your perspective that the world order is stable take climate change into account? Most scientists agree 200 million to a billion people could be displaced in the next 30 years. The WHO estimates climate change will drive 120 million into poverty in the next 10 years. Will efforts to combat climate change influence the distribution of global economic power?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like you said, very thoughtful. And also points to the limits of my argument, because I guess what I'm trying to say is in the short to medium term, things are stable, but we don't want to sit on our laurels, so to speak. First of all, there are enough challenges that if we got lazy right now, could get worse, largely with China, Russia, North Korea. But also there is this whole unaddressed agenda, or at least insufficiently addressed agenda, including on climate. In fact, one of the things I do in this new book that's coming out in the spring, The Art of War in an Age of Peace, is I say, the Pentagon's had this threat framework that General Joseph Dunford, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he used to call 4+1. So it was Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and then transnational extremism or terrorism. So 4+1, that last one being a little different kettle of fish. So Dunford called it 4+1. I would say there's a new 4+1, which does not supersede or supplant the first 4+1. It just makes the world more complicated. And that is biological disease, including pandemic, but also biological weapons. Nuclear proliferation, which has been around for a while, but could get worse and remains a problem with Pakistan and North Korea and elsewhere. Climate, by all means. Digital threats, including cyber hacking and then someday artificial intelligence. And then finally, our own domestic weakness and dissension as a nation, which makes us less stable at providing the kind of global leadership that I think the rules-based order requires. It needs this one strong central power that has a lot of allies. Without that kind of a mechanism, without the US playing that kind of a role, I don't know that the global order remains stable. So I agree fully that the new 4+1 has to be very much on our minds and suggest that whatever short to medium term structural strength we have in today's order, it may not last if we don't get after the new set of 4+1 threats more effectively. And in terms of where migration could be the greatest, we already saw in 2014-15 what could happen with a Syrian civil war, partly exacerbated, we think, by climate, creating huge streams of refugees into Western Europe. So certainly North Africa and the Middle East into Europe is one very consequential potential migratory flow in terms of core Western allies, core Western interests. Also, I worry about what could happen with India and Pakistan if the glaciers continue to melt and they no longer have the deal on sharing water in the broader Hindus river system. And then they wind up seeing movements of people who are displaced because they can't farm the way they used to along those rivers because the distribution system is no longer adequate or it just breaks down altogether. Those would be two places. Flooding in Florida, flooding in New York, flooding in Eastern China with rising sea levels and worsening storms. These will be problems, but these are the kind of problems that I don't know if they're going to have huge repercussions for world politics. They're going to be important problems for the countries that have to confront them and increasingly borrow the techniques of the Netherlands and other places that know how to build moats and dikes. And we're going to have to turn Florida perhaps into an archipelago of a lot of city-states, by the end of the century. I mean, I'm not even kidding. That's really the image that I've settled on in terms of the most likely future for Florida. It's not going to disappear underwater, but every single part of it may virtually be fortified or given up, one or the other. But we can do that. It's not a pretty picture, but I don't know that has international political implications, except that it puts more burdens on our economy and therefore makes it harder to fund the military and science, research, and development. On the other hand, it may create more jobs and more infrastructure spending, which could actually make some working class jobs and middle class jobs reappear. And I don't want to be facetious, but I'm just saying, I think China and the United States will both handle their own challenges from global warming pretty well domestically. But the places where I think this could really have implications for global stability would largely center on South Asia, the broader Middle East, North Africa, and therefore flows of people into Europe.
So, George, if I could just pick my one last favorite out of and then I'll let you wrap it with whatever icing you'd like. Somebody asked, what about Vice President-elect Harris's views? How will they come into to color the foreign policy that the U.S. pursues, or will they?
That's an excellent question. I think that Joe Biden's got a lot of people to please. And most of all, he needs to make sure that Democrats don't just get crushed in 2022 and 2024. After an election that showed surprising strength for the Republican Party at a time when they were being led by a commander-in-chief that a lot of people didn't really like, and even Republicans often had mixed views about, and yet they had a good election every place except the top. And even Donald Trump got the second most votes in the history of US presidential politics, more than any previous winner. So I think Joe Biden's got to worry about how to make sure they don't lose the next election, which means he can't do what Bill Clinton did the first year and a half, or Barack Obama did the first year and a half, and sort of be seen as pursuing, fairly or unfairly, if this is the way it's portrayed, but being seen as pursuing an ultra left agenda. I don't really think that Clinton or Obama did that, but certainly they were critiqued for trying to do too much and push too far in the progressive direction. So anything that Biden does on domestic or foreign policy, he's going to have to sort of really do his homework first. So for example, Green New Deal. Green New Deal, whether Harris likes it or not, is not the sort of thing where she or anybody else is going to be able to persuade Biden to pursue that. Biden was smart enough not to talk about banning fracking, because otherwise he would have lost Pennsylvania. And he almost got in trouble with the issue anyway. So this presidential politics stuff is not going to go away. In fact, we're already seeing essentially the early harbingers of the 2024 campaign, even though we can't quite yet be sure who the candidates will be. And my point is that whatever Harris does, she's going to have to master her issues really well, probably pick 2 or 3 issues that she decides just to get really good at. And if she does that, then I believe that she could be an effective vice president. Either way, she has a distinct possibility of being the president of the United States in 2025, if not sooner. And so she is positioned in such a way where she herself has to think about being, avoiding creating political vulnerabilities by pushing too far in any one direction just because ideologically she might want to. So I'm sorry, I'm just speaking in, about a multiple set of pressures on Harris and Biden. But I really think that the good news for Vice President-elect Harris is she doesn't seem to be that ideological to begin with. And maybe that was part of why her own presidential campaign sort of floundered, because she could never quite be that authentic on any issue because she's so inherently centrist and pragmatic that when she tried to be the more progressive candidate, that didn't really work. When she tried to be the latter day Obama or whatever on issue X, Y, or Z, that didn't really work. She's just a smart lady who's well prepared across a number of issues. And I think if she wants to be influential with Biden, she, again, in summary, has to do 2 things. One, prepare herself across all issues so she's ready to be president if and when that becomes necessary, or if and when she's the party's nominee in 2024. But then secondly, just like Biden himself, she has to find 2 or 3 issues where if she's going to push hard and push for something big, she better do her homework and don't throw out, grandiose ambitions that sound like sort of a caricature of a ultra progressive or liberal politician, because that's going to be easy pickings for the Republicans as they gear up for the next 2 elections.
Thank you.
Well, Wendy, you said we want to shoot for 1. So yeah, Mike, last word. Is there any one thing or focus that we should have, any watchword or stance or problem to focus on that we should take away? We've gotten a full range of strategic education so far.
Oh, I don't know if you've gotten that much of an education. I've had fun trying to handle the very challenging and fascinating questions from all of you. And again, I appreciate the opportunity. I still think you have to put nuclear weapons and nuclear war at the top of your list of short to medium term worries, which is why I think we all should maybe reflect on what happened in 2017 when we almost went to war against North Korea and draw whatever lessons we can there. We should reflect on what it would mean to go to war against Russia or China and not think of these kinds of conflict scenarios in classic terms of who wins and who loses, but more about how do you prevent the war in the first place? And if it starts, how do you stop it? Stopping it is actually more important than winning it, because victory itself could be a meaningless concept if we get into a full-on confrontation with either of those countries. So if there's anything that makes me, apart from the longer-term worries, as many in the in the group rightly underscored with things like climate. If there's anything that really makes me worry, it's those flashpoints where there is a sort of plausible path towards nuclear war. And probably the future of Taiwan is one of those, which is why I'm so adamantly opposed to that particular idea of John Bolton's that you mentioned earlier. Certainly, if we were careless about deterring aggression by Russia against the Baltic states or other Eastern NATO members, that could cause me concern. But I think we've done a better job of pre-positioning capability to make that less likely. If we get carried away with NATO expansion again and really try to bring Ukraine or Georgia into the alliance, as we promised in 2008, that could create that kind of a showdown with Russia with potential nuclear escalation ramifications. So I think I fall back on the age-old, truth or mantra of just saying, watch out for nuclear war. And whatever you can do to lower its odds is probably the single most important thing for the short to medium term stability of the planet.
Wow, thanks very much. So I'll be on the lookout this spring for The Art of War in an Age of Peace, which will further the education in strategic affairs for any of us who find it. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been wonderful for us.
I didn't do it earlier, so I'm putting in the chat a link if you're interested in looking at Mike's upcoming book in May, pre-ordering it from the Yale Publishing site. And I want to apologize to our audience members whose questions we didn't get to. There was just an avalanche of them, but there were so many good things that we could have dug into. Thank you so much, Michael O'Hanlon, for being here with us, and George for, driving this conversation as usual in such a thoughtful way.
Well, my pleasure. Thanks to you. And I just put into the chat, I'm not sure if everybody can see it or not, but I put in my email address if anybody wants to follow up that way, if you really haven't gotten enough of my worldview in the course of this last hour. But I'm particularly grateful, and thanks for the patience at making something happen that we've been trying to achieve all year. And I'm also thrilled to be publishing with Yale out of the great state of Connecticut. And so my best wishes to all of you for the holidays and beyond.
Thank you. One last word from one of my board members in there says, please make a contribution, a donation to the World Affairs Forum. We need you. Thank you. Everybody have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you all.